Tonight, we have stories involving gas stations, haunted dolls, and many other strange phenomena. A huge thank you to tonight's writers. Without them, this video would not have been possible. Remember to send in your story if you'd like to have it featured. Stories can be submitted at my subreddit, r/slumberreads. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoy. It really does help out the channel. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Stay safe out there. Enjoy the video. And as always, I hope you all have a great night. I've always been interested in the things most people consider either non-existent or unexplainable. Anything occult, demonic, alien, or some horrid mix of them all. For me, this is more than a morbid curiosity. Since childhood, there are events in my life which I could easily lend these descriptors. Events that I can only believe were most likely caused by the impossible. What happened to me this week, however, I know for a fact was something otherworldly. After a work shift in the city, I decided to fill up my car. It was late, and so there would be no one at the station. I pulled up into next to the pump, my headlights illuminating the darkness between me and the store. Enjoying the solitude this time brought me, I went about filling my car. The only other vehicle at the station was a large, articulated lorry. I noticed that the driver was sat in the cab, but I could not see from where I was whether he was asleep. I did not have to wait long, as he exited and began to walk towards the store. I struggled to see him, until he got close enough for the electric lights of the store to bathe over him. The man was middle-aged, and his clothes were scruffy. He had very little hair left, and was bridging the gap between chubby and overweight. His smile was the worst part about him, though. Before entering the store, he turned to look at me. He held a large smile, so wide it looked like it hurt. He kept it for the whole time he spent staring at me, occasionally turning to check his lorry. Uncomfortable barely even describes how I felt. Some relief came when the man finally entered the building. I placed back the pump and closed the cap on my fuel tank, and I repeated over and over in my head about how I would be home soon. The reason I came late at night was to get away from people, especially people like this. On my way to the store, I began to feel a strange sensation in my head. It wasn't pain, but more like an aura. I had heard stories from friends who had felt things like this, and it usually followed with tales of suffering at the hands of a migraine. Luckily for me, this wasn't a case for a developing migraine. It was something so much worse. I began to hear a noise. Even now, I'm not sure what it was. It was wispy and light, and I'm surprised I even registered it. I turned in its direction and found my eyes resting on the large vehicle that was now unoccupied. I've always had a morbid curiosity, as I've told you. You need to understand that. To understand why I approached the trailer of the vehicle, I was desperate to know whether there was something off about the lorry, or whether I was hearing this in my head. The tone of the noise had lowered slightly, and I began to realize that it was whispers and crying, not wailing but very light sobbing. It sounded as though there were people all around this trailer, whispering indecipherable sentences to each other while others wept. I could see no one, even as I stood next to it. The image of the driver and his ominous smile swirled around in my head with these invisible people growing louder. I almost fell to my knees in the darkness. My senses overloaded despite there being no one here at all. Seconds later, there was silence. I could hear my quickened breathing and feel my blood rushing, and that was all. Having calmed down now, I pressed my ear to the trailer. There had to be something responsible for those noises. There was no noise, but still I began to worry. It became apparent that the driver must be returning soon, and I didn't want to be spying on his vehicle when he did. I decided that the noises were in my head. I lifted my ear from the trailer and began to wrangle with the implications. Nails on a chalkboard. That is the best way to describe the sound I heard as I began to turn away. Horrible scratching sounds that only continued to grow in number. I felt repulsed. My body physically cringed from whatever darkness was inside this trailer. I pressed my hands to my ears, and at this point, I decided I would run. I could hear so many of them. It was like dozens of little fingers frantically clawing at the inside of the trailer. It was so clear. I could even hear nails breaking against the metal. I felt my heart begin to race, and it started getting harder to breathe. What kind of cargo was this? What was that man keeping in there? I had no intention of finding the answer to these questions. The courage I had on approach to this trailer had melted away. My safety was all that I was concerned with. I turned to leave, and I almost collided and fell over the man stood behind me. I managed to stop myself, and my eyes rested on that unforgiving smile. Are you okay? You look awfully worked up. His smile breaks only enough to deliver his words before returning. I somehow managed to place some words together. What are you keeping in there, man? He looked at me quizzically, like I had asked a stupid question. Food. The trailer is carrying boxes full of food. What do you think would be in there? Just doesn't sound like food. I let out a weak smile of my own. It didn't work on him. I assure you, there is nothing in there, just food. The smile had begun to fade away. The aura overcame me strongly again, this time met with a large dose of dread. I felt the weight of his boots on the ground with every step he took towards me. I mustered up all that I could and ran towards my car. In my mind, all I could hear was the sound of the terror inside that lorry and the boots of the driver quick behind me. I got to my car short of breath, sure that he would be right behind me, ready to grab me, force me to join whatever torment lay within his cargo. He instead remained, stood by the cab. He hadn't followed me. I didn't think about it for long. I was quick to get into my car and leave. He watched me get into my car, and his gaze followed me as I left. One final glance in my mirror, and I could see that he was directly behind the car as I pulled onto the empty road. He let out a wide, overbearing grin. This story is kind of long, so I apologize in advance. Growing up, my sister and my mother were seriously into collecting porcelain dolls. My dad built shelves all around my sister's room where they would sit. My mom brought home this really old chest or trunk one day. I'm not sure where or how she got it. I think her grandmother passed away, and a lot of her old possessions were up for grabs and divided amongst the family. I remember being there with my sister when she received it, and how horrible this trunk smelt when it was opened. It was a musty, rotten odor mixed with cat piss. It permeated my sister's room immediately upon opening. My mom took it upon herself to clean it, but the smell never really came out. The doll itself was really old, probably 1940s or 1950s. Its face was cracked around the eyes and mouth and blackened. My mom cleaned it up as she was really good at doll restoration. Anyways, it went up on the shelf, and over time my sister began explaining about it being creepy, and that she felt like she was being watched, but my mom insisted it was an antique, and that my sister only thought it was creepy because she saw it before it was restored. As time went on, my sister started screaming in the middle of the night, and said things would move on their own. Dolls falling off shelves, light shades spinning a bit, her blankets being dragged down a bit. My older brother said he noticed things like the blinds in her room would be closed, and when he would come out of the bathroom, they would be pulled up a bit, enough to be noticed. No one would be home either. My sister usually left her door open. We all did. My sister became increasingly paranoid about the doll, and took it upon herself to put it back in the chest in her closet on the shelf. Just a basic sliding door closet. She would ask me to sleep in her room with her, and I even seen her sliding closet door inch open slowly late at night. I would wake up randomly, sometimes having to use the washroom. I would be so scared to get up and go, whereas in my room, I wouldn't feel that hesitation. My sister eventually began camping in my room when her dolls started moving. The eyes would change directions. Sometimes the heads would move direction to face the door. At this point, my mom was pissed off because she thought my sister was just outgrowing a hobby they both enjoyed. But more so my mom, who put thousands of dollars into, and was making up an excuse to get rid of the dolls. My dad was much more keen to actually listen, so he set up cameras to record at night. These were the older camcorders with the cassette tapes. I think they are 8mm or 16mm, not sure. He must have found some compelling footage, because he quickly removed all the dolls, along with the creepy one with the cat piss smelling trunk. I was fairly young, but I remember being alarmed when my dad did remove all the dolls. You can sense something is wrong in a way. He had a small box where he kept all the recordings, but he wouldn't let us watch them. He also never admitted that anything creepy was going on. My guess was that he didn't want us to worry and to remain ignorant to what may have been happening. My sister was terrified and peeing her bed almost every night, so it makes sense. My dad didn't talk about it, and neither did my mom. It wasn't until a few years ago at my mom's house where my mom openly talked about the creepy shit that was going on. We were on the topic of paranormal stories, and she brought it up. We had so many questions for her. She danced around details because she is a pothead with a horrible memory, but it was creepy reliving those memories. We were kind of laughing about it, but the goosebumps were there for me at least. My mom said my dad took the dolls and had them all incinerated, and that for a few years after that, they experienced some creepy things happening in their bedroom, which was why they renovated the unfinished basement into their new living space and lived down there. She said her walk-in closet in the upstairs master bedroom would open at nighttime around the same time, 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. My dad would wake up to their CRT TV, turned on to a dead channel with white noise static. Things would be moved, and their bathroom light would turn on and off, sometimes even the water tap. The room was uninhabited for the most part. My parents kept all their furniture up there to be used as a guest room, also kept extra clothes and random things in the closets as storage space, but my sister mostly commandeered it as a hangout for her and her friends when she was in her teenage years. The creepy things kind of toned down as the years went by, because we didn't focus on it too much, but looking back, our house was definitely haunted as hell because of that old doll my mom brought home. $30,000 for the cure to everything. One time I was at a pharmaceutical sales convention in Nashville, and I had a chance encounter with a washed-up laboratory chemist. The man I met was in his 60s and looked like he had succumbed to chronic alcoholism. I went to his company's booth at the convention, and I really didn't understand what he was saying. He kind of fell asleep while he was standing and talking to me. I was amazed he didn't fall to the ground. Kind of chuckled to myself and then went to the next booth. About 4 hours later, I retired upstairs to my hotel room, where the convention was being held. Eventually, I got bored in the room and decided to go down to the hotel bar. Not surprisingly, the same alcoholic was there drifting in and out of sleep. He saw me and hinted for me to come over. Heck, nobody else was there, and I really didn't want to sit by myself. I sat down beside him in a bar chair. He then told me, "I have a secret." I was really only half listening to him and my eyes were more focused on the bar's entrance to see who was coming in, so I could leave this guy and sit with someone different. Then he said to me, "I know something that would put each of these pharmaceutical companies out of business." He really seemed to perk up when he started to explain this to me. I was like, "Yeah, whatever. Go on, explain." He told me him and his former colleagues had explained a way to figure out the exact reason what was wrong with someone. I have an extensive science background, so he really needed to tell me something concrete and logical for me to listen, and he did. He basically described a mechanism in the central nervous system that, when wired to this machine, would give an exact cause where the problem was coming from. For example, someone comes into the doctor's office and is depressed. After asking a few questions and assuming it's just stress related or a change in someone's life, this machine would be able to tell exactly where in the brain or body the problem was coming from, and then you could correct the real culprit of the problem, instead of just treating the symptoms. Everything he said made sense, and I told him now, all I needed to see was proof that the machine works. He explained to me, "If you learn too much, you will go away." He then explained that he was working indirectly with a group of about 10 laboratory scientists, where they developed a machine and tested it on rats initially. Then when they perfected the machine, they tried it out on a human. The human was actually one of the scientists who had a seizure disorder. The machine actually pinpointed a problem in the test subject's lower spinal cord that would never have been detected and or would have never been considered the attributing factor to the seizures. Once again, I said it sounds ingenious, but he said, "You will disappear." I explained to the man I had no family and I wasn't concerned about the risk. He then went on to say that of the 10 scientists, 6 died of heart attacks within a short time of each other. 2 have vanished, and the other 2 are in mental institutions. I then said, "Well, you're here." He then went on to say, the company didn't know I had any connections to the 10 scientists or the experiment they were working on. All of the scientists were vetted out with extreme caution because one of the biggest challenges was finding scientists who wouldn't tell anybody anything in order to maintain secrecy for copyright issues. The company didn't realize that my role was in regards to my consultation in developing wires that interfaced with the body's central nervous system. He then said, I just didn't attend their meetings or get paid directly through the program. He then gave me his address and then passed out on the bar. I thought to myself, I may have finally found a way to afford a yacht in Monaco. His address was in Texas, and I was going to Texas for another convention in a couple of weeks anyway, so I decided I would stop by his house then. I was really excited and did as much research on what he told me. I even found the obituaries on the scientists who had heart attacks. I arrived at his address. It was a 2-story brick row home. I knocked on the door and I was surprised when he opened the door, and of course he was drunk. We small talked for a few minutes, then I got to the point. I asked him for evidence. He was actually able to show me a video from the lab experiments that were conducted. I was absolutely amazed. Of course, I wondered what his angle was, or what he wanted. He exclaimed to me that he had advanced cirrhosis of the liver, and he had weeks at most to live. He said he would give me all the blueprints and the actual machine. In exchange, he wanted to go to Amsterdam and indulge in drugs and alcohol and then die. I felt completely sold. I had all the evidence I needed. He said, give me $10,000 and you can have everything. I had that money in my bank account, so I had the cash wired to him. I rented a U-Haul and took everything he had regarding the machine and everything that came along with it. He reminded me not to tell anyone, or else I would suffer the same fate of the other scientists. I drove back home and took the machine to my pharmaceutical company's laboratory. My company that I worked for was relaxed. They didn't care what I did, as long as I made them money. I worked for days refurbishing the machine to make it work. After weeks, I determined that I was missing something. I couldn't recreate what I watched in the video. I figured there was a gap or a piece of machinery I was missing. I didn't have the alcoholic's phone number, but I did have his address. I flew back to Texas, then I went to his address. He wasn't there. I looked in his window, and his whole house was completely empty. I remember he said he wanted to go to Amsterdam, so I decided that if I wanted to be rich, I'll have to go to Amsterdam. I took a week off of work and flew to Amsterdam. I went to every bar that I could possibly find. Eventually, after 25 bars, found him. He was sitting by himself, completely plastered. He was too wasted to show any emotions. I was a little upset, but I didn't want to make him mad. I explained what I had done as far as getting the machine ready. He then was able to figure out what I was missing. He told me to come to his hotel room the next day, and he would have the part I need. I didn't trust him, and I demanded some assurance. He actually gave me the majority of the money back with a stipulation that he would give the money back once I received the part for the machine. I felt comfortable with the arrangement and vowed to return the next day to his hotel room. The next day came, and I knocked on his door. He opened the door and I went in. I promised him that I would have one drink before I left his room. Halfway through the drink, I completely passed out. I woke in the same room. I was now on a metal hospital gurney in extreme pain and completely naked. I looked down at my stomach, and I had a long suture about 12 inches from the bottom of my rib cage to below my belly button. There was an additional man in the room dressed in hospital scrubs. It was then explained to me what had happened. Somehow, the alcoholic got my blood type and learned I was a match to his blood type. He then came up with this elaborate story about the machine that was completely made up. The alcoholic needed a liver transplant, and because he was still drinking, he didn't qualify for a transplant, so we found a surgeon who had his license removed and could no longer practice being a surgeon. In exchange for $30,000, he performed a partial hepatosectomy, where only about half of my liver was cut out and transplanted into the alcoholic. I stayed 2 days strapped in the room where I was given pain meds and anti-rejection medications. They kept my mouth muzzled to shut me up. I really don't know why they didn't just kill me. On the third day, the former alcoholic left the room. The doctor untied me from the gurney, and then the doctor left the room. I really was too weak to do anything other than walk out of the room. I called the authorities both in Amsterdam and the United States. Everything the former alcoholic did and said was a lie. That was never his house in Texas. He rented it for a month under a fake name, and he did nothing more than rent a table at the pharmaceutical convention. The surgeon was long gone, and probably onto his next hotel case. At one time, I was a young woman who found my soulmate by going to quirky cult classic movie showings, such as the Rocky Horror Picture Show, Trolls. Now I found myself alone in a city. I constantly move about every 6 months to a different city. Every time I go to a grocery store, I always have to look over my shoulders. Anywhere I move to, I have to give a fake name and take jobs that pay in cash. I'm writing this story as a form of therapy. I can't afford a therapist, and I can't sign up for welfare without giving up my social security number. My husband Mark and I enjoyed going to flea markets to buy and sell movies. We liked more obscure VHS tapes that weren't well known. One day, Mark and I came home and found a movie on our porch. The movie was labeled My Nazi Revenge and had a note on it stating, "I figured you'll like this one." I can only guess at who dropped it off. The movie was of low quality, shaky camera work, like the Blair Witch Project. The movie can be summarized like this. A German squadron who went through a Polish town during World War II and terrorized a rural farm. The Germans killed all the family members, and only the father, who was severely wounded, survived. The Germans inadvertently left a paper that had their names on it. Years later, when the war was over, the father vowed to track down the men who killed his family. By looking through German military records, he was able to track them down in a town in Germany. All but one of the men had escaped to Argentina. Reaffirming his vow, he goes to Argentina. The father learns that the men found refuge on a remote Argentinian island. After his short boat ride to the island, he systematically tortured and kills all of the Nazis and their families. Mark and I were shocked by the gruesome nature of the movie. But what stood out more was that the only credits on the movie are the German soldiers and the father. In doing what we usually did with movies we purchased, we looked online to see what it sold for. There was no reference to the movie. Upon many hours of research, we were able to find a small article from World War II regarding the fire that killed the father's family. We also found that the German soldiers were all from the same German town and listed as MIA. Rewatching the movie, we found clues about the Argentinian island's whereabouts. Research provided little information about the island, but we did discover a property record from 1946. And the half-mile island was bought by a Juan Alvarez. No other information about Juan Alvarez was discovered. Having had a vacation plan to South America anyway, we added a trip to the mysterious island to our itinerary. The island is completely isolated, so we knew we would have to rent a boat. Upon arriving to the impoverished Argentinian town, the locals seemed impoverished and downtrodden. We asked around and nobody was aware of a low-budget movie being filmed there. It appeared that the Argentinian government leaves German immigrants alone, perhaps because of a large financial endowment. After renting a boat from a local man, we used the research we did online and Google Maps of grainy photos. We were able to tell that the island was about 2 miles away. We passed by small mountainous, uninhabitable islands and determined that they were not the island we were looking for. Eventually, we got close to an island riddled with no trespassing signs, like the ones we saw in the movie and the grainy Google Maps photos. We laughed And I say I guess the film crew didn't clean up. After docking our boat, we realized the same houses from the movie were still there. The houses were in shambles from years of storms. We joked to each other about the preserved movie set. After wandering around, we entered one of the houses and discovered skeletonized corpses. We were appalled and shocked and discovered the same outcome in the other houses. We didn't know what to do except leave the island in a hurry. Not knowing who we can trust in the mainland, we returned the boat and cut our trip short. From our research, we knew one German man from the movie didn't go to Argentina. With the assistance of a small Israeli company that specializes in finding missing Nazis, the Israelis tell us the German man was in the database, and they couldn't do anything to him due to a lack of evidence. The Israelis do tell us that his name had changed several times, and he now lives in the United States. We didn't have a phone number for the German man, but the address is around 400 miles away. We decided to drive and knock on the German man's door. We figured he should be in his 90s. Amazingly, an old, thick, accented German man answered the door. We explained the reason why we have come, and the German man started to cry and invited us in. He knows about the movie and says, "I'm so sorry, but you're both dead." This alarmed us, and we waited for the man to go on. The German man explained his plight and what happened after the war. He says that he has moved around multiple times, and says wherever he goes, the Polish father finds him. The German man says his wife and his whole family have been murdered over the years, and that the Polish father made him watch the movie and said that every relative will be killed. The German man told us he had kids that he had to give up for adoption and never knew what happened to them. At that point, I gasped, realizing that the German man was my grandfather. We then realized what the German man meant about us dying, and that the movie was purposefully mailed to us to show the horror of what my grandfather did, and in turn, the demise of the German men's relatives. My grandfather continued to cry and apologized. I asked, "What can I do?" And my grandfather said, "There's nowhere you can hide, nowhere you can go. They might be outside right now. They might come tonight. They know where you are." We returned home absolutely petrified. The movie had vanished. The same day we went to the police station and they didn't seem interested in what we had experienced. The movie was gone. My grandfather said because of being a Nazi in hiding, he wanted nothing to do with the police. The police told us to contact the Argentinian authorities. I was still on leave for my job at the time. Mark went to work the next day, and he didn't return from work that day. I called his job the next day, and they told me he left the previous day with nothing out of the ordinary. I called the police and filed a missing person report. I called all of our friends and posted flyers, but there was not one inkling of any type of clues of what happened to him. Every time I left the house, I put a piece of masking tape where the front door met the frame to tell if someone was in the house. 4 days after Mark's disappearance, I noticed the tape had been torn. After I returned from hanging up flyers around town, I knew it wasn't Mark because he would have called me, and he wouldn't have locked the door after returning. So I left that day with all of my earthly belongings in the house. I had nothing besides my credit cards, car keys, and my phone. I cut and dyed my hair. I had to abandon all my friends and ditch all of my online social media. Anything I enjoyed in the past is now in the past. I loved Mark so much, and now I have nothing. The only hope I have is that the Polish father will die, and his hired goons will just go away. I've never spoken to anyone about what happened that night. It was almost 20 years ago now, which feels crazy to say. Hard to believe the early 2000s were 20 years ago, or that I'm nearly 40 now. Time flies, doesn't it? I got to thinking about it again because I saw it in the news that it had finally been torn down. I was barely 20 then, still in college, going for a degree in film, doing pretty good too. I was lucky enough to have fallen in with a good friend group. My roommate at the time was a solid guy with an even keel. He was fun, but he knew where the line was, and he surrounded himself with similar types. Thankfully, it turned out I was one of them. We were all in the arts program. He was dating a really nice guy who was aspiring to be an actress. This was just a few years after the Blair Witch Project hit the theaters, and blew up film as we knew it, and it seemed like found footage was now the thing to do. Everyone was doing it. Everyone had their own spin, their own idea, their own story, some local thing or legend. We were no different. Caleb was no different. When he threw out the idea to go to a film based around our own local legend, everyone was on board, including me. It wasn't hard to get a room, even on a college kid's budget. The hotel had seen better days. Bankruptcy seemed to haunt the owners. Every person who bought it fell on hard times almost immediately afterwards. Most recently, it was a chain of discount motels. Rumor had it the chain was going under. People claimed it was bleeding money, and that it wouldn't be long before the hotel closed its doors for good. The mood that night was celebratory. More like a kid's slumber party than a makeshift film set. We were all camped out in Caleb's room going over the plans for the next few nights. Everyone was taking it really seriously, despite our age. We really wanted this to be good, wanted to do good work. Maybe we should have been a little less dedicated. Every one of us decided to get an early night's sleep so we could get started first thing in the morning. Maybe if we'd stayed up, done the normal college kid thing, it would have turned out differently. We went to bed instead. I spent a few minutes playing Snake on my cell phone before turning in, made sure to set my alarm, texted my partner to say goodnight, and then tucked myself in without waiting for a response. They were working nights at the time, and I figured they probably wouldn't get my messages until they were getting off work sometime in the wee hours. I fell asleep surprisingly easily, considering how early it was. Must have been exhausted from logging the equipment up, and down the stairs all day. The elevator was out of order, and frankly, I wouldn't have trusted it even if it had been working. It probably hadn't been updated since the 30s, when the hotel was built. I don't usually dream, or at least, I don't usually remember my dreams. Never have, but that night, almost as soon as I drifted off, I slipped immediately into the strangest and most haunting nightmare I've ever had. I was slumped in the bottom of a bucket, the old tin kind. I can vividly recall the scent of damp metal and rust. My legs were stuck out before me. I could see my knee through a tear in one of the striped pant legs. Not my pajamas, not my knee. It was wooden and jointed. The pin that held it together gleamed like exposed teeth, and it was raining. I remember not being particularly concerned about it in the dream, despite the fact that the rain was gathering in my bucket. My chest was made of wood. I had no need to breathe. Water was slowly filling in around me, rising up past my arms, lying limply on the floor beside me. Give up. I heard a woman's voice above me. It was as loving and tender as my mother's. I recall thinking that she wanted the best for me. She only wanted to help. Let the fight be over. Lay down. Let it all wash away. By then, the water was at my elbows. I could feel it weighing me down, seeping into my bones and turning them to anchors. There will be no more suffering, no more struggle. Upper arms now, closing in on my shoulders. Sleep. The pain will end. Rising around my throat, lapping at my chin. This was it, I thought, feeling glad and numb at the same time. Finally, it was almost over. I could rest. I could finally rest. But then, just as the water reached my nose and began to close over my head, a swell of music, a rush of pipes and piano, so startlingly clear and sweet that it startled me awake, gasping and gagging. I lurched for the side of the bed in a panic, and for an instant I thought I saw a woman, a withered, skeletal woman with empty eye sockets, and nothing but a few decaying wisps of dark hair clinging to her leathery skull, looming over me, reaching for me. I don't know if I really saw her. All I know was that the sight of her propelled me up and out of bed. Despite the crippling nausea and waves of vertigo, I was driven by the need to get up, to get out, and in a state of complete terror, I ran for the first exit I saw, the fire escape. The window was stubborn. It was stuck. I had to fight to get it open the first inch, and then the next 3. And then I just stopped bothering and took the desk chair to it. The glass popped like fireworks, the impact reverberating around the chair. But that first taste of air was so sweet and delicious that it felt like a kiss from a god. It swept away the suffocating sweetness of the air inside for a moment, Just a moment, but that was all I needed. I scrambled out onto the rusted, creaking stairwell. Tumbled was probably a better word. My legs barely wanted to work. It felt like I'd been wading through the sea for hours, and barely had the strength to crawl a few more feet before my body gave out altogether. It started to rain while I laid, waiting for the thing inside to come get me. I could feel it looking at me, beckoning me. But I didn't even have the will to lift my head. I was clinging to consciousness by my fingertips, but I could hear it inside. Not the woman, but the song, Greensleeves, my ringtone, over and over. It didn't stop, not even when the sirens and flashing lights arrived. They found me on the fire escape. I was the lucky one. I got off with some long-term health effects, but at least I survived. None of the others made it. They found them all, every one of them, still peacefully curled up in their beds. Carbon monoxide poisoning was the official ruling. An old building on the verge of closing down. An unfortunate accident that took the lives of every other person in the building that night, down to the poor man at the front desk. 23 people in total. I still think about it some nights. About her. When I'm laying in bed beside my partner, staring at the ceiling. We're married now. And I've never been more grateful for them. To this day, I'm convinced they're the only reason I'm alive. If they hadn't called me that night when they got off work, and kept calling when I didn't answer, I asked them why, when they came to see me at the hospital. At the time, they claimed to have had a weird feeling, gotten worried about me. They didn't tell me the whole truth until years later, after our wedding. Apparently, they dozed off for a few minutes at work and had the strangest, most horrifying dream about a small wooden doll laying in the bottom of a tin bucket filled with rain. As a kid, we would go to upstate New York on vacation to meet up with extended family members. My grandparents owned a house which was passed down from their parents. I loved playing with my cousins. The area was completely remote. You had to drive a mile down a private road to get to the house. We went at least once a summer. But that tragically ended in the later 1980s, when two of my uncles and my 9-year-old cousin vanished one day. As I recall the story, my whole extended family, about 30 people, were staying the weekend in the house. Some of the older kids would sleep in tents outside because there just wasn't enough room. And the kids liked camping as well. It wasn't uncommon for my uncles to look for an excuse to get drunk and pretend to hunt deer. We were all city dwellers. None of my uncles really knew anything about hunting, rather than put bullets in rifle, aim at deer, and shoot. One Saturday afternoon, my two uncles and cousin ventured out into the woods. Typically, they would get drunk and return after a couple of hours. That Saturday, they didn't return. I recall about supper time the adults joking that we will see them returning those woods at any time with no deer. As nighttime approached, and still no signs of their return, then I remember the mood had changed, and the adults started to freak out. The adults went out searching for them. I remember being able to hear my family members yell their names through the woods. Eventually, the police arrived, and they formed a search party. They searched all night, and the next day with no sign of them. We extended our stay at the house so my parents could assist in the search. We stayed for a week and there was still no sign of them. We went back to NYC, and my dad would go back to upstate NYC every weekend to search for them. Understandably, we stopped going there as a vacation retreat. 2 years went by, then 5 years went by, then eventually 20 years with no bodies being found. There was nothing, no clues at all. It really changed everything in my family. None of the adults ever seemed happy again. Fast forward to just a few months ago. I was perusing through free horror movies on demand. You know, the ones where you have to watch commercials and really weren't good enough to be featured on, say, Netflix. I read the previews for one of the movies, and it was eerily similar to what happened to my uncles and cousin. I decided to watch the movie, and the coincidences were extremely unsettling. There was a long road to the house. There was about the same amount of people who were at the house that Saturday. even to the smallest of details on how 3 of my male cousins would play on this large boulder in the back of the house. I was glued to the TV because this was literally going to explain what happened to my lost family members. Then it eventually got to the part where one of the locals who lived in the woods kidnapped the 3 of them and sadistically killed them. I immediately phoned my brother, and in turn he contacted the rest of my family members. Eventually, we contacted the police and they interrogated the writer of the movie. Based on the police investigation, it was determined that the actual writer who took the credit for the screenplay didn't write the movie. He actually paid a ghostwriter through bitcoins for his idea on Reddit. My family and the police watched the movie for any clues on where the bodies could be. Another search party was assembled, and the bodies were found buried in the basement of a remote cabin, about 10 miles from my grandparents' upstate house. The whole family was just perplexed. Who wrote the movie? Who knew all of these intimate details of our family? The police were unable to figure out who sent the story through Reddit. The ghostwriter went through great lengths to hide his computer and phone's IP address. My whole family went through every possible suspect, including everyone in the family. Everyone agreed it couldn't be anyone in the upstate house that day. Then, weeks went by, and I must have watched the movie 200 times and still no suspect. Then one day, I was watching old home movies, and something extremely sinister occurred to me. My grandfather back in the early 1980s would draw lines. He would draw the lines on paper, on wood with the pointed end of nails, basically on anything as a nervous tick. Then after my uncles and cousin disappeared, he stopped doing it. So I completely forgot about it. Those lines were important because I remembered seeing 2 of them in an indiscreet area on the inside door of the cabin. I knew I really had to sit and think before I accused anyone of anything. Then I came up with a possible scenario. My grandfather told my 2 uncles and cousin to go to the cabin, and he would meet them there. Then, when the search party went out to look for them, my grandfather went out on his own to the cabin and killed them. My grandfather then went back to bury the bodies in the cabin. I explained the scenario to the rest of my family, and most of them agreed with me and were in shock and horror. My grandfather was dead, so he couldn't be held accountable. But I knew the motive. He wanted the upstate house for himself. My grandparents were the only ones who continued to visit the house after my uncles and cousin vanished. Still, the mystery remains. Who actually wrote the story? My grandfather was dead when the writer of the movie received the story from the ghostwriter. I don't think whoever wrote the story was actually involved in the plot or the actual murders. I think the ghostwriter just wanted to tell what they knew. Talking to the rest of my family, they remembered my grandfather veering off from the rest of the search party only to return hours later. They also remember my grandfather returning from one of the searches covered in sweat and dirt. Everyone who was there that week collaborated those events regarding my grandfather, and everyone agreed it was virtually impossible for anyone to have assisted my grandfather. Also, everyone agreed that someone who was there that Saturday was the ghostwriter, potentially even my grandmother. Which would really be dark because there was actually bitcoins exchanged for the story. I meant to write this right after it happened, August 13th, 2020, but was a little shaken up and tired of explaining it to friends. My boyfriend, 22 male, and I, 21 female, took a road trip to Estes Park, Colorado. We left on August 12th around 8 p.m. and arrived at our Airbnb lodge at 10 a.m. August 13th. I discussed with the host that our check-in time be changed from 3 p.m. to 10 a.m. He confirmed it was changed and set. Our lodge was about a 15-minute drive up the mountains in the middle of nowhere. The place was family-owned. We arrived to the lodge, and it's empty. I got an instant bad vibe, but thought I was overreacting due to the posts I read. This place has 32 rooms, 2 stories, 16 rooms per floor, split symmetrically on each side of the lobby, creating one long hallway per floor. There were about 3 cars in the parking lot, confusing me due to the popularity of the Airbnb ratings. We ring the bell, and the owner comes out confused. We say we're here to check in, and he got no word of an earlier check-in. He gets us checked in, and goes over the list of rules for about 8 minutes. He shows us our room, first floor corner, number 111. I'm into numerology and I was excited. Meanwhile, a lady in running clothes is behind us observing. I thought she was in line, so I didn't think anything of it. When the owner wraps things up and gives us 2 keys to our room, we go back outside to grab our luggage. Upon walking out the front door, the lady in the running clothes, which I thought was still in line, was standing in front of the lodge with a sly smile at us as we walked to our car. I didn't think much of it, but wondered why she wasn't going on a run or talking to the owner. We grab our stuff and walk back into the lodge and go to the right down the hallway. I caught an eerie man out of the corner of my eye from the left side of the hallway, behind us, walking towards the lobby. My boyfriend goes, "Who the fuck is that guy?" I looked at my boyfriend as he said it, looked back at the man to get a better look. There was no one in sight. We got to our room, had a view of the parking lot, not the backside full of nature as shown in the Airbnb pictures. The room was a lot smaller than shown. No fridge, microwave, and no deadbolt. There was marks left from a deadbolt lock, but looked as if it had been removed. There was a second door outside to a shared balcony, and a view of the parking lot where our car was. Upset? I apologized for the room I picked, but all was well. We decided to get some groceries and explore. The people in the grocery store were zombie-like. I often people watch, but what shocked me was each person I looked at was already looking at me and did not look away upon making eye contact. I concluded it was just a different town with different people. I travel a lot and am not a judgmental person. We hiked a trail, I forget the name, and find this clay-built structure with old fireplace remains. A native man, 22 male with braids, comes up to us and starts talking to us. We talk a while, very smooth. I felt like I knew him. We talked to him for a good 40 minutes. Conversation was great. He tells us he's alone here from Vegas, sleeping in his car. He was really trying to get the name of the place we were staying at, but my boyfriend, Jay, wouldn't go into much detail after 3 different questions about it. I got a bad vibe and said we had to go. We get back to the lodge and go in our room. I asked Jay if he felt this place was off. He said no, but thought the lady in running clothes was odd. Upon talking, our one door connected to the hallway starts shaking as if someone is opening it with a key. Not quietly. Jay goes, "Hello?" No answer. Jay is also not a judgmental person and has never believed in paranormal experiences. He opens the door and looks down, and a lady he described as witch-like says in a panic, "I was just testing the key. I didn't know anyone was here." We understood and brushed it off, but then I started thinking rationally. I told Jay I would understand if they were testing the key before 3 p.m., as they didn't expect us. But I looked at my phone, and the time was 3:40 p.m., as groceries and exploring took us about 4 hours. I also thought it was odd they were testing the key on the day of our arrival. He asked if we should look for a new place. I was happy as I was thinking the same. I began looking and he kept our second outside door open just in case. Flies were constantly flying in, so we would have to open the door for about 5 minutes. Close for about 2 minutes. He did this about 4 times and often went out on the shared porch. A man was sitting outside 2 doors down. We didn't think anything of it. A huge fly flew in again, and we closed the outside door for a few minutes. Side note, it's completely silent here. It was very peaceful, and we could hear each sound of nature as our window was open. We are sitting on the bed and we hear a clear, sharp click right outside our place. Our eyes shoot up at each other, and we are shocked and silent. He gets up slowly and goes to open the outside door, but cannot. It's completely jammed. He's a strong man and tried his hardest to open it, but no luck. I started packing frantically. We are now locked in our room from the outside, and our aware employees can get in our room from inside the lodge. We go outside and try to open it from the porch. No luck. I go in the car and FaceTime my mom and explain what is going on. I often claim paranormal happenings, and I sound like the boy who cried wolf. She wasn't buying it. Jay grabs the phone and says, "I know she said stuff like this before, but this time is different. It's not safe here. The staff acts as if they are in on a plan." She gets more serious and says she is booking a hotel in Boulder. All we have to do is go inside and pack. This was very difficult for me because I knew that if anything were to happen to us, now was the time. Jay told me to keep my mom on FaceTime and bring her with us. Upon walking to the stairs behind the building, a man on a bobcat comes flying by us. Jay said he stared at us the whole time. I was too afraid to look. We enter the most right side of the lodge where our room is. Upon thinking how glad I was that no one was down the hall, a guy and a girl appear on the opposite end and start walking towards us. We run into the room, and I set my phone up against the wall so my mom can see if anyone were to come in. I packed the fastest I've ever packed. I was in front of the bed as Jay steps around me, as the space was narrow. He pauses and goes, "What the fuck?" Under the bed there was a rug. He lifts it up, and we see a risen area of the floor. It looks as if it can open. He knocks on it. It's hollow. Beyond panicked, we take our first load. The side stairs lead to the back, and there was a man on a ladder working in a garage space that happened to be right under our room. He walks toward us and starts to say something. I noticed Jay picked up his speed, so I start running to the car. I told Jay I'm sorry, but I can't go back in. My mom was still on the phone in the room. She later said the people there looked scary, but I don't know how or when she would have seen them. Jay gets the second load and leaves his key in the room. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life waiting for him to get back into the car. We start to drive away as he remembers my key is still in my purse. I asked him to please run back to the room and be safe. He comes back a minute later and said he had to leave it on the doorknob because the door was already locked. We felt really bad for leaving without saying bye, but genuinely did not feel safe enough to do so. It was the scariest experience of my life. Thank you for reading, and feel free to comment possible explanations, questions, and kind critiques. I picked up 2 Ring floodlights and cameras and installed them about a week ago. I live in an okay area. Occasionally druggies trespassing. Initially why I had the camera lights installed. They cover my front yard and the side of my house outside my window. Ever since I installed the security, no more crackheads trying to steal my stuff or break into my shed. But something else has been troubling me since then. As I mentioned, one of the cameras is right outside my window, so when it detects motion, it'll flick on and start recording. It didn't bother me much, but one night, I thought I heard running, heavy thumping footsteps in my backyard. Angry and full of adrenaline, I grabbed my rifle and sounded the alarm on the cameras, but nothing. No crackhead, no Bigfoot. Just my backyard and a house you could hear from 5 blocks over and see from space. I thought nothing of it after calming down and went back to bed. I reviewed the footage from the cameras in the morning, but there was nothing to be seen. No crackhead, no Bigfoot, no nothing. The next couple of nights I thought I heard something, but my central air unit would always turn on and lull me to sleep with white noise. I was finally coming down until last night when I heard a tapping on my window. This shot me into a panic. I went to pull the curtain back and look, but something, like a guardian angel, stopped me from doing so. I grabbed my rifle and my phone and opened up my security app to view what the hell was tapping on my window. It was odd. Tons of noises and motion, but no lights. Not even when I tried to turn them on. They just wouldn't go. After what felt like hours, I popped in my earbuds and fell asleep clutching my rifle. The next day I reviewed the footage from last night. I started to play with the brightness to get a clear image of who or what was outside my window. It was grainy, but I thought I made out antlers or the skull of an animal. I couldn't think of anything but what I saw that day. Work came and went, and by the time I got home, I didn't want to be in my room. I went in and out as quick as possible to get my guns and get in my office. As I settled in, I got a motion alert from my front lawn. I started to sweat, opened my app, and saw a hunched, dark figure staring at the window to my bedroom before making its way into my backyard. I'm tired, I'm scared, and I don't think I'll sleep tonight. I'm armed, but I don't think I'm ready. I can hear that tapping now in my head. I know it's waiting for me to go to bed. Hopefully, it doesn't figure out where my office is. When I was about 16, 9 years ago, my family was living in a suburban area outside of LA. It was a nice neighborhood. Kids rode their bikes in a group. Parents waved at each other and helped keep an eye on people's houses. You could join a barbecue if you walked by at the right time. Well, my dad was working nights at a hospital in the city, and that left myself, female 16, my mom, female 36, my sister, 12, and my brother, 8, home at night from 6:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. the next day. One night, we are cooking, listening to music and just all around having a good time, and everyone's in bed by 9. I'm woken up to the sound of our front door being rattled, and my mom calling for my dad like he is home. Our house was laid out like this. There's a front door and a small entryway, and the right side wall, facing the door from outside, was my brother's room. Myself and my sister were on the other side of him, and the doorway led into our dining room. My mom's room was off from the living room towards the back of the house, so she would typically turn on the lights to come by our rooms. It wasn't all that uncommon for my dad to get let off a shift a few hours early and end up home before 7. My front door was frosted glass in the middle that was clear enough we could see whoever was at the door. It was old and a little off, so typically you had to put a little force into opening the door, even if it's unlocked. This part my mom filled in. She had gotten up, also hearing the door, and thought my dad was home as I did. However, upon calling out for my dad to confirm and turning on the light switch, whoever it was at the door froze and noticeably jumped. She had still been walking closer to the door to open it to help him, still half asleep, when she realized the man in the doorway was as tall as my dad, but had a full head of hair, as well as his outline not matching the familiar outline of my dad coming home in his scrubs. The man was wider than my dad, and once he could see my mom in the doorway, he started not only turning the knob but throwing himself against the frosted glass. Okay, back to what I know. I don't know what kept me from rolling over and going back to bed, but in the next few seconds, I heard my mom scream and sat up in time to hear her footsteps and see her as she disappeared into her bedroom to come back out with a revolver my dad had bought for her birthday. At this point, I had rolled over and checked my cell phone quickly to see it was 1:30 in the morning, and had dialed 911 while my mom was pointing the gun at whoever was at the door, trying to force their way inside. "Stop or I'll shoot you. I'm on the phone with the police, and they're on the way. I will use force if you enter my home." My mom was screaming it at the huge man at the door who, after hearing her the second and third time, finally stepped back from the door and was just staring at our shapes from the other side of the frosted glass. After a few moments, though, he seemed to like his chances because he stepped forward again and only ran once my mom pulled the pin back and repeated what she had been saying, adding that she might decide to not even wait for him to be inside. He ran off, as I mentioned, and I stayed on the phone with 911 as my mom stood at the doorway, her gun still in both her hands, aimed at the door the way my dad had taught her to hold it just the weekend before, when we'd all gone to the range. It was only a moment after the man had fled that 2 uniformed officers filled the doorway the man had just been in, and when they knocked, I realized, after she didn't respond to them identifying themselves, how terrified my mother was. Her voice was shook as she told the officers that she had a weapon, but that she wanted to hear their badge numbers before she would open the door, so I could confirm with the dispatcher. Once they did, she opened the revolver and unloaded it, putting it on the table and crying as I opened the door for the police. They took our statements, had several patrol cars out looking, and found him a few hours later 6 blocks from our home. However, he made it into the residence he was trying to break into, and they caught him in the middle of robbing the retired couple he had knocked unconscious. I would have never thought that my first sleepover at my friend's house would turn into the creepiest night of my life. I'm going to give more background on the area I live at so you could understand where I'm coming from. I live in a small town in Estonia, where there are less than 6,000 people. It has never bothered me or anyone I know because we have everything we need to survive. The crime rate is almost non-existent here, so this happening has left me and my friends a lot of unanswered questions. I'm a female. This happened in July. I went to my friend's house at 6 p.m. We basically hung out until 10 p.m. That's where things started to get weird. I had gone upstairs to get my phone, but on the way, I saw a car that was parked on my friend's lawn that I'd never seen before. I called my friend upstairs to see what the car was doing there, and then she told me that the car was there the day before too. So us being a little creeped out, we told my friend's mom. She didn't really care that much, so we just watched the car for like 10 minutes. After 10 minutes or so, the car drove off. At 11 p.m., we went outside to jump on my friend's trampoline because we were bored. At this point, it was getting dark, so we decided to go near a lamppost that was near my friend's lawn. My friend made TikToks, and I challenged myself to walk out at 12 a.m. I didn't go too far, just like 100 meters. I had never done that alone, and that's why it was so peaceful. When it's night in my town, there's nobody on the streets, and barely any cars were passing by. When I saw a car's headlights, I would run back to my friend because I didn't want to be caught at 12 a.m. walking by myself because I was underage. One of those times an ambulance drove by, and I was like running to my friend's lawn with a dark hoodie on because it was a little chilly. But at around 12:30, I start to notice the same car that was on my friend's lawn earlier. Then I started shitting bricks. I told my friend, and she started shitting bricks too. We kind of hung out near the lamppost, but whenever a car passed by, we would hide behind my friend's bush that was also covered by a tree. And it was right in front of the road. We started to notice the car driving by every 3 to 6 minutes, but there were also different cars that we noticed were driving by frequently. After an hour of this, it had calmed down a little bit. What I mean by that is that the cars didn't drive by that frequently anymore. We decided to wait on my other friends to see if they would come by again. We waited for about 15 minutes, and none of the cars drove by, so we decided to go inside. In the process, getting scared shitless because of water that was dripping on a bag outside. It sounded like someone tapping the bag, but when I checked, I found out it was just a plastic bag. We locked the front door just to be safe. My friend doesn't have a back door, so we didn't have to worry about locking that. Nothing happened for the rest of the night. It's safe to say that we passed out on my friend's couch at 5 a.m. after being on our phones all night. I would say I got an hour of sleep not because I was scared, but because her dad came downstairs to get ready for work. It's been a couple months, and to this day, I have a lot of unanswered questions. Who were the people in the car? I don't want to know what they would have done to us if they ever came out of the car. I think me and my friend were lucky that this wasn't something physical.